It's the year 1994, and a team of archaeologists are driving north along the Peruvian coast. The air is dry, and the scenery before them is a desert. They drive to what appears to be a hill or a mountain, but to the trained eye, they can see that it is man-made. One of the archaeologists in this team is a woman by the name of Ruth Shady, and she will become the leader of the excavations around this hill. Now, under this hill, and in fact other hills surrounding the area, is a pyramid. This pyramid is about 100 feet tall and took up an area of about 4 football fields. And in the desert surrounding these hills, they discovered a city about as wide as 150 acres and would have held about 3,000 people at the height of its time.
The ancient settlement of Caral is in Peru, South America. It's here that the remains of the oldest known civilization in South America have been found.
Hi, and welcome to my channel, where I discuss all things relating to archaeology and anthropology. And today I want to talk about the sacred city of Caral. Now, the city of Caral, although it was discovered relatively recently, is one of the oldest cities and one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And by civilization, I mean that it is one of the 6 hotspots where civilization developed relatively independently of each other. Other hotspots are Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, Asia, Mexico, and where we'll be discussing today in the country of Peru. Now, when we try to define these hotspots, there are certain checkboxes that we like to think about. All in all, we're describing the shift from nomadic type peoples to more sedentary agricultural type of people. So when you have a group of people who are more nomadic and maybe migrate throughout the year, they don't necessarily have ways to store a lot of food or have a lot of domesticated animals or plants. Now, that leads to smaller populations for those types of lifestyles. Now, contrasting that with more sedentary lifestyles, then you can have a place to store more food. You can have fences where you keep your stored animals and fields to grow your grains throughout the year. And when you have an abundance of food like that, then you can start thinking about a more stratified society where you have people in different professions. Maybe you'll have some healers, maybe you'll have priests and leaders and laborers and builders. Maybe then you'll start having a diversity in classes, a social hierarchy, for example. That's when we start thinking about a more stratified society. So that's when you can start seeing more growth in population, in social complexity, and this is where we start seeing more urbanization. For example, towns growing into cities, and these cities potentially even expanding into small states. Another checkbox we like to have for these civilizations is a means of communication via some kind of symbolism. For example, the Egyptians, they had hieroglyphs, and the Mesopotamians had cuneiform. Well, for Peru, where we'll be discussing, they didn't necessarily have communicated words such as that, but they did have a form of writing and record keeping called quipu, which are essentially cords knotted at various important intervals, which communicated some kind of record. Now, I want to go back to the city of Caral and how it was discovered. Now, scientists knew for a long time that people were occupying those lands sometime in the past. They knew it from different settlements which were scattered around the valley that the city is located in, and as well as irrigation systems which were photographed much earlier in the 50s. But they didn't know that the city existed, much less that it had pyramids to it, and that the city was as old as they thought it was. They thought these people had inhabited the valley much later than they actually did. Carbon dates from this city actually placed it as far back as 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. And that's the same time as the early pyramids in Egypt and even the mammoths. And this fact surprised scientists quite a lot because they haven't actually found any pottery or any kind of fired clay as they did in other early civilizations. And that led them to believe that the civilization wasn't necessarily as advanced as it actually was. And they also didn't believe that all the various settlements were part of a whole identity of people. But that leads to the question of how could a city become so large with all these monuments and be as technologically regressed as they would have thought? 3,000 people is quite big for a city that old. We'll actually get into some likely reasons why they didn't have pottery, as well as some other technologies they did have later on in this video. But first, I think it'd be worth it to talk about how the city even began. Peru is very roughly divided into 3 regions. There's the coastal region on the west side, there's the Andes mountain range, and then there's the Amazonian forest on the other side. What happens is the clouds will come in across the jungle and they'll get caught by the mountain range, and most of the precipitation will fall on the Amazonian jungle, and only about 6 milliliters per year falls on the coastal region. So it's a very dry and arid place. And not only that, although it looks like a desert, it is a colder desert in this coastal region. The currents around the coast, they're cold currents, and that leads to this moisture-proof barrier or dome over this region. So that kind of begs the question, why would such a big city appear in this harsher environment? Well, those cold currents, they're actually very nutrient dense, and it leads to a lot of marine resources that can be fished from there. So one of the most prominent theories is that they first began as fishermen and had an abundance of food that way, and that led them to be able to do farming. As I mentioned, there was evidence of irrigation, and that wouldn't have happened really overnight as it could have in, for example, the Fertile Crescent. And that would have led into this sort of positive feedback loop where the crops they grew, namely cotton, would have been able to help them create better nets and be more efficient at fishing. And although there's no evidence of pottery, there is of fishing nets and basketry being made by organic materials. Now, Ruth Shady proposes that these people in the valley, all the different settlements, they're all part of the same social identity, which she called the Norte Chico people. She bases these conclusions on the fact that there appear to be a lot of architectural similarities between the various settlements and the city itself, as well as similarities in their ceremonial practices and their religious beliefs. And it would appear that for the Norte Chico people, their capital city was the city of Caral. And the city appears to have grown and achieved its level of social stratification and complexity as sort of coming out of this place of being the middleman that would have mitigated these relationships and trades going on between its people. Now, to some extent, that's all speculation, but what we know is that the city did achieve a level of social stratification where there are different class levels of people, and they would have lived in different areas. For example, the city has different classes of neighborhoods. There's an upper class with bigger, more grandiose houses, and then the lower class, which are more simple dwellings. Some of the gathering places as well, such as the pyramids, seem to have been restricted for certain elite members of society, and other places were designated for more commoners. Now, this city, it has 6 different pyramids and 2 sunken circular plazas where they would have gathered and had their ceremonies, as well as a number of different fire altars. That's why sometimes a city is called the City of the Sacred Flame. What makes this civilization so unique for its time, though, is that so far they haven't discovered any weapons. And when we're discussing things like social stratification and elite classes and commoner classes and things like that, you're kind of thinking that, maybe there would be some weapons involved as a means of controlling the people. But so far, nothing of that nature has been found. Not even any walls, any kind of fortifications that would lead to them needing to defend themselves from any outside groups of people who are wanting to attack them. And that leads to the belief that these people really didn't have any threats from outside sources, which also leads to another thing in that they didn't really have any influence from any other cultures. For example, in Mesopotamia, you're in this fertile crescent where there are lots of different groups of people influencing each other and attacking each other, and you build bigger armies, better defenses, and you're just pushed to progress all that much more faster. So that makes this civilization a very organic and very unique civilization. That is to say, though, it's not like they didn't have any kind of contact with outside people. There are evidence of trade or some kind of exchange going on. There's snail shells, there's conch shells, there's bird feathers that aren't local to the area, as well as cocoa seeds for cocoa plants that are definitely not local to this area. Now, in regards to their religious practices, they did involve flames, as I mentioned before, and it would have had a lot of music in it as well. Around these two sunken plazas, there have been found a lot of flutes made from bird bones, from condor bones, and that's also where they found the quipu as well. And as peaceful as I said that this civilization was, that's still according to the standards of people 45,000 years ago. They did do human sacrifices. And the way they did that was with how they built their pyramids. The way they built their pyramids was kind of this religious process. They built them in different sequences. They're stepped pyramids, and each base was built at different times. And at the top, then they would build in a person to entrap the soul to be the protector of this pyramid. So when they were excavating these pyramids, in the topmost room of one of these pyramids, under the floor stones, they found the skeletal remains of a human male. This male was in his 20s. The physical wear on his bones showed that he was some kind of laborer or maybe some kind of courier who ran a lot. There's a lot of wear on his heels. And his hands were tied behind his back, and he had a wound to the frontal bone of his skull. So probably a blunt force trauma was his cause of death. And then he was cast into this cavity underneath the floor, and then the floor stones were put on top of him. Now, interestingly, when they did excavate the walls behind some of the stones, they did find human finger bones likely belonging to this male. And that leads to more questions about what their beliefs were regarding human sacrifice. Maybe trapping more parts of this individual in not just the floor but the walls as well leads to a more stronger bond between the soul and the building. I don't know, it's pretty interesting. Now, we talked a bit about what we know of their religious practices and their ceremonial rituals. What was their day-to-day like? What was it like for an average person? Well, we can tell what they ate. They ate a variety of seafood, such as anchovies and shellfish, things like that, as well as from the dental enamel. Scientists can figure out what kind of plants, roughly what groups of plants they ate. So it would have likely been a lot of sweet potato, a lot of maize, beans, and then they would have had a fermented drink, maize drink, because of course they had alcohol. Now, for their technology, they had some pretty cool innovations. First off, the pottery I mentioned, or the lack of pottery, that was likely due to they just didn't need it. They did have like squashes and different kind of boards and things like that that would have been hollowed out and would have served like very nicely as vessels and containers to store and carry things in. They would have had fishing netting, as I mentioned, as well as their irrigation systems. So the valley that the city of Caral is located in, that's called the Supe Valley, and it's named after the Supe River that runs through it. But the river itself, it doesn't actually flow year-round. It only flows a couple months out of the year. It's fed by springs and glaciers from the mountains. So what they did was they irrigated from the river, but also from the mountains as well, to water their crops and give them a reliable source of drinking water every day. But they also had ventilation systems in place for their ceremonial fireplaces. They use the Venturi effect, where air flows faster through constricted passageways, and they would have blown air into their fireplaces to be able to create bigger flames. They also had, which I think is really cool, they had sort of seismic resistant bases for their foundations and their buildings and pyramids. It was essentially stones woven together with netting that would have created these sort of baskets that would have been part of their base for their foundations and their buildings, that would create more of a stabilizing cushion for when earthquakes happen. This area of the world is very seismically active, and that would have helped with safety and security. Now, the Norte Chico people, they persisted there for about 1500 years before they disappeared. And it's not known exactly why they abandoned their city, but there could be a couple of different factors. For one thing, the seismic activity that I mentioned, that could have just been a more active year and made it not wise to stay there. Another factor could have been the El Nino event that happens every 2 to 7 years. So for this area of the world, it's actually pretty drastic. What happens during an El Nino is that current that I mentioned, that cold current, it's called the Humboldt current, that comes up from the south, it switches and it reverses for a couple of months. And that drastically changes the food chain and the nutrients that the fish get. So the fish become unreliable as a form of sustenance for the people. And if they were greatly relying on that, as well as the seismic activity could have affected their irrigation systems and the water supply, that could have all culminated together to be a catastrophic event for them that would lead them to abandon their city. And speaking of abandoning their city, they didn't just leave it and it got buried. It appears to have been intentionally buried under layers of gravel and then sand. And the fact that the city was buried, it led to some pretty great preservation. There wasn't parts of the city exposed for looters or for stones to be carried away for other building projects or anything like that. We have a pretty good picture of what the city of Caral was like. But one of the things we don't have yet is a cemetery. Sure, there's the bodies found here and there, but not a localized place where people would have buried their loved ones. And when you don't have that, you don't really have a picture of how people were living, what their beliefs were like. For example, what would you bury with your loved ones for the afterlife? And then we don't really know what people would have been dressing in day to day, or what the social stratification would have looked like in a burial context. For example, if the upper class, if they had a lot of grave goods, different things with them, or if the lower class didn't have anything. And you also don't really have a picture of what their professions were like. For example, any occupational wears on the body that would maybe have shown on the skeleton. And then you don't really have a clear picture of exactly how peaceful was a society. Maybe they did fight with each other a lot. Maybe that would show on their skeletons. Maybe they were buried with some kind of weapons, or maybe their weapons were organic in nature that wouldn't have lasted for 4,000 years, but would have shown on the body. And all these things may not ever be discovered. The city of Caral and the Norte Chico people's civilization was designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that does afford it some protections, but there are some dangers encroaching on the city of Caral and its surrounding area. And one of those dangers is land pirates who are encroaching on the land and developing it essentially. The city of Caral is pretty close to the city of Lima, the capital city of Peru. It's about 3 hours north, so it is in danger of being developed into part of the city. Ruth Shady, she still is the director of the research team of the city of Caral, And she and various members of her team and her lawyers, they are getting death threats from these land pirates, trying to scare them off from protecting this World Heritage Site. And unfortunately, this could lead to a decrease in tourism around that area, which is pretty vital funding for the research. But that's it for today. If you made it to the end of this video, I very much thank you, and I would appreciate it if you could leave a like or a comment. And if you want to see more of these kinds of videos, feel free to subscribe. And thank you, and have a very great day.